In high school, I wrestled for Glencoe. Now, for anybody in the room that's wrestled before, I think we could all agree it's not an easy thing to do, right? It's a one-on-one sport, right? It's just you, as the picture shows, it's just you and one other person. You look good. If you fail, I was 5% body fat and just amazing. Amazing. I haven't been there in decades. So anyways, moving on. But we used to do this weird thing when we were kids, right? And I can't really explain it. But it was just it was a game we all kind of played with each other, except for where normally you play games and, everybody wins, like cooperative games. This is one where the person who is the target of the game does not win, okay? We'd have these tournaments, right? And so, Saturday, Sunday tournaments, we'd go to these things. Hillsborough High School held this Research Tournament of Champions. Now, traditionally, many tournaments would just occur within your league, right? We were in the Metro League, which dates me. For any of you know, Metro League hasn't existed for a long time. But in those tournaments, no big deal. You just kind of knew everybody, right? You knew who your competition was, and you knew how good they were because you'd already wrestled them maybe once that year, maybe twice. So no big deal, right? But you get into these bigger tournaments, right? State especially, immediately the moment you're at state, right? You've got a bunch of guys that you didn't wrestle all year long. And some of them were good enough that the Oregonian, back when we had paper newspapers, would come out every Sunday and show who was ranked what in each weight class, right? And so you would see that, so-and-so from Forest Grove was ranked number 2 in state. Now that doesn't mean anything, it's just their current situation, right? It's how good they've been, how many matches they've won, how they've won them, okay? But we played this game where in these tournaments, as each of us would progress through the tournament, we would start to look ahead for our teammate to see who they were wrestling next. Because of course we wanted to build them up. No, we wanted to let them know, hey dude, did you know you're wrestling the guy who's ranked number 3 in state next? Now I know on the surface of it, that's probably useful information, but really all we're doing is trying to psych out our teammate, if you can believe that. What other sport does that, right? I can't think of a single sport where they're like, oh man, have you seen who you're about to go up against? That running back has you outweighed by 50 pounds. You're going to get pancaked. That doesn't happen. Okay. Also, again, team sports, if things go poorly for you, like the running back is outweighing you by 50 pounds, the good news is you're surrounded by linebackers who probably weigh the same and they're going to have your back. Wrestling doesn't work that way at all. Individual sport. It's just you, and then we find out how good you are. And I know that in my time, all that really did was create a lot of doubt, right? It wasn't a big deal. 3 in state, I got this. It didn't create this confidence. What it created was this general idea that, oh man, that match is in a half an hour. And then you'd sweat it the whole time. Like, how good is this guy really going to be? Can I even hold my own? Should I even go out there? Should I just try not to get pinned, right? I don't care if I lose 15-0. Just don't get pinned, right? I don't need pictures of me in the Oregonian next week, flat on my back, just crushed underneath this guy. By the way, that's happened to me before. You can probably go back and find those pictures. Please don't. Please just don't. I like you all. Let's keep our relationship there. So, at any rate, doubt is it's one of those things, right? And it's not just in sports, right? We can have this kind of doubt creep into our lives all the time, right? So here's where we're going to enter into what we're talking about today. Gideon from Judges. Now, looking at Gideon's life and story, it's easy to see him wrestling with some doubts and feelings of inadequacy, right? He could have stayed in those feelings of self-doubt, but God doesn't leave him there to struggle alone. Throughout Gideon's story, we're going to see a God who comes alongside him and lifts him out of that doubt, kind of slowly, and it is slow, but surely God pulls him up. Now, Gideon's story can be an example to us on how to overcome our feelings of doubt, our feelings of inadequacy. And that's by turning to a God who loves us and wants what's best for us. So as we're going to explore Judges 6 through 8, which is a lot of material to cover, and I'm going to stay on point as much as possible because it's literally 3 chapters. We're going to talk about his doubt and his fear, but we're also going to talk about his journey out of that fear and into confidence in the Lord. So Gideon's story really starts with the Israelites and their inability to faithfully trust and follow God. Now, anybody who's read Judges knows this is nothing new. There's no surprises here. They've been doing this cycle of sin throughout the entire book. They start off, they're trusting, they're worshiping God, times are good. Then they start turning slowly from God to worship these false gods, and times start to get rough. The people get oppressed by another group, and then all of a sudden they cry out to God for their salvation, right? This should all sound familiar. God hears them, hears their cries, has mercy, and sends a judge. The people are saved by the judge, and let's just walk that back. The people are saved by God through his workings through the judge. They repent, they follow God, rinse and repeat the cycle. Now, when this story begins in Gideon's time, right, I love this photo, right? The Midianites are the current oppressors of the day. Now, they're these camel-riding marauders from the tribe of Midian. In case you don't know, Midian was the son of Abraham and his second wife, Keturah, and they'd been in conflict with the Israelites since the Exodus from Egypt. So this is not a new conflict. In fact, Israel had almost wiped them out during the 40 years in the desert, but for whatever reason, they had chosen to spare the girls in the tribe of Midian. The Midians don't look like this. This is some amazing image I found in a Google search, which I just loved enough to put up here. I'm pretty sure they probably carried swords and other, war implements of the day. But so anyways, here we are much later from the Exodus, and the Midianites have now been raiding the Israelites for the last 7 years. And the Israelites are so scared of them that they've taken to sleeping in dens, caves, and strongholds to avoid just being caught out in the open, right? The tribe of Midian has grown so large that in Judges 6:5, it compares them to locusts and say they and their camels could not be counted. When the Midianites showed up, they literally would take everything and leave nothing for the people of Israel. Now, that sounds awful, okay? And if that was my situation, I think I would probably be like, yeah, no, we need help. We definitely need help. This can't continue, right? 7 years of this can't continue. So the Israelites come to their senses and they cry out to the Lord. And God hears them and immediately comes to their rescue. No, I'm just kidding. That's not the story at all. He sends a prophet, and we see it in verse 8. And he said to them, "Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, I led you up from Egypt and brought you out of the house of slavery. And I delivered you from the hand of the Egyptians and from the hand of all who oppressed you, and drove them out before you and gave you their land. And I said to you, I am the Lord your God. You shall not fear the God of the Amorites in whose land you dwell. But you have not obeyed my voice." Now, despite this recrimination from God, which calls them out in their sin, he's still already putting into motion a plan for their salvation in the form of Gideon. Now, it's probably easy when we think of Judges to remember one of the most famous of them. This is not Gideon. This is Samson. And for those of you that hated this movie, I apologize ahead of time. This was the best image I could find. Samson was, as the kids would say, an absolute beast. I always actually thought, I was surprised this guy got the role because this always seemed like a Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson kind of role, you know? Like just guy with, a neck the size of both of my legs, literally both of my legs. Although I think we all know that hair is kind of an important part of Samson's, story. So obviously, it explains why The Rock didn't get the opportunity here. But so anyways, here we are imagining this mountain of a man, right? Just nothing but muscles just for miles, just real warrior, virtually invincible, afraid of nothing. But this really couldn't be farther from the truth when it comes to Gideon. See, Gideon was no warrior. He's a farmer. And in fact, he was pretty deathly afraid of the Midianites. And when we find him in this story in Judges 6, he's so afraid of the Midianites that he's actually in a wine press beating out wheat. Now, for those of you that don't know, and I didn't really know, I'm like, well, why not? I mean, wine press does kind of suggest that we would be pressing wine in it, right? But what's the problem with beating wheat out in a wine press, right? Like, that shouldn't be a big deal. Well, as it turns out, it does kind of matter. It makes the job significantly harder. And normally, wheat would be beat out on a hill where the wind could blow the chaff away, basically doing a lot of the work for you, right? But Gideon is so afraid of the Midianites spotting him and immediately descending and taking everything that he is now hiding inside of a wine press, basically below ground, so they can't see what he's doing and come flying in and take his hard-earned wheat. And it's during this moment when an angel of the Lord appears to him. Now get this, the angel greets him with, "The Lord is with you, O mighty man of valor." What an introduction, right? I mean, I've heard the word valor before, okay, but I've never bothered to look it up for a definition, right? It just sounded like something cool. I think there was a movie a long time ago, like Men of Valor or something. I watched it. It was a military movie. Seemed really cool, and I just kind of took my definition from there. But let's hear what the dictionary defines it as. It defines it as great courage in the face of danger, especially in battle. Now, I'm not going to leave you there. Let's go to the Hebrew word, which is honestly just as amazing. And it's pronounced kayil. Not only does it mean mighty, but it also means efficient, able. God is telling Gideon that he considers him to be this mighty, efficient, and also able person, right? Now, what? I mean, hold on, back up a second here. I'm pretty sure when we find Gideon, he's doing something that I might classify as kind of weak, maybe even a little bit cowardly. I mean, he's doing what might be one of the least mighty or courageous things around, right? He's hiding in a wine press. It doesn't seem mighty to me, and it certainly couldn't have been efficient, right? Because he had to separate all the chaff from the wheat himself instead of letting the wind do it. However, thankfully, even though we only see these things, God sees so much more. God sees Gideon's heart and knows that here is a man who is not only mighty, but efficient, and we're going to see a little bit more about that further down in the story, about how efficient Gideon is. Now, Gideon is able to follow God and put him first, which is exactly what the Israelites need. But it takes a minute to get there, right? And in addition to the angel calling Gideon out as mighty and courageous, he also mentions something that honestly I think is even more important. Did you guys catch it? The Lord is with you. How awesome would that be to hear? Could you imagine, like you're just like hanging around and poof, angel of the Lord appears to you and said, God's with you. That's got to be a huge shot of confidence booster right there. I'm just saying, if it was me, I'd be like, yes, I've been waiting my whole life to hear that firsthand from an angel of the Lord. But Gideon doesn't seem to notice at all. Instead, he goes right into this questioning of whether God is really with them. And we see this in verse 13. And Gideon said to him, please, my Lord, I don't know if he said it this snarkily, okay? If the Lord is with us, why then has all this happened to us? And where are all his wonderful deeds that our fathers recounted to us, saying, did not the Lord bring us up from Egypt? But now the Lord has forsaken us and given us into the hands of Midian. So a couple things to note here. Number one, Gideon seems to forget what got them there in the first place. And that can often be the case for us too. We can completely ignore taking responsibility for our own mistakes, our own sins that put us in a bad situation. This is also kind of the typical response that we might all remember from our youth, kind of the equivalent of, it's not fair, without taking any ownership for our part in it. Also, secondly, Gideon seems to call into question whether God even cares for them. And that's pretty tough. I mean, have you ever found yourself doing the same things when times are tough? Asking, God, do you even care about me right now? That's so weird. I totally practiced this out and didn't think it was going to hit me like that. Can't you see all that I'm struggling with? I know for me that I have had those moments. And it's very easy to doubt God's plan for you when things aren't going the way you think they should. We can start to question whether we should just come up with our own plan, right? Let's just bag it. Whatever God's got, he can work that. We're going to go ahead and we're going to take control. We're going to get things back to normal, back to good, like they used to be. But we need to remember to hang in there, to trust in God, because his plans for us are always for our good. The tough times refine our faith and force us to lean on him when we might instead lean on our own power. All right, back to Judges. And in this moment, God directly responds to Gideon's objection in verse 14. And the Lord turned to him and said, go in this might of yours and save Israel from the hand of Midian. Do not I send you? I love this statement because God's not letting up on the initial greeting. He's not giving up. He's not throwing the towel in. He says, go in this might of yours and save Israel. Do not I send you? Now, who can ignore that? God directly calls him mighty and courageous and tells him to save Israel because he is with him. This should be a huge confidence boost. God's literally telling him, go, I'm with you. Romans 8:31 comes to mind here. If God is for us, who can be against us? Now, obviously, Gideon didn't have the benefit of that verse at the time, but for us, it rings so true. If God is with us, what worldly might could possibly stand against us? Now, unfortunately, Gideon doesn't even seem to understand what's happened. He responds in a weak way with an excuse for why he just won't measure up in verse 15. And it says, and he said to him, please, Lord, how can I save Israel? Behold, my clan is the weakest in Manasseh, and I am the least in my father's house. Now, God doesn't leave it there. And the Lord said to him, "But I will be with you, and you shall strike the Midianites as one man." And he said to him being Gideon, speaking to God, "If now I have found favor in your eyes, then show me a sign that it is you who speak with me. Please do not depart from here until I come to you and bring out my present and set it before you." And he said, "I will stay till you return." Now God again reminds Gideon of who has his back. Gideon tries one last time by testing whether God is really for him. Really, whether it's even God speaking to him. Now, let's take a moment to recognize a couple things. Gideon's not alone in trying to avoid this responsibility that God's given him. In fact, we see it in Exodus 3:11 through 4:16, which is a ton of verses. We're not going to go through all of those, but this is Moses' exchange with God at the burning bush. And this is what Exodus 3:11 through 12 says. "But Moses said to God, 'Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the children of Israel out of Egypt?' And he said, 'But I will be with you.'" Sound familiar? "And this shall be the sign for you that I have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall serve God on this mountain." Moses isn't done. Like I said, we go all the way through chapter 4. "But Moses said to the Lord, 'O my Lord, I am not eloquent, either in the past or since you have spoken to your servant, but I am slow of speech and of tongue.'" I want to pause right there. First off, who's slow of speech and tongue and knows the word eloquent? Moving on. "Then the Lord said to him, 'Who has made man's mouth? Who makes him mute or deaf or seeing or blind? Is it not I, the Lord? Now therefore go, and I will be with your mouth and teach you what you shall speak.'" Here's Moses again. "O my Lord, please send someone else." Then the anger of the Lord was kindled against Moses, and he said, "Is there not Aaron your brother, the Levite? I know that he can speak well. Behold, he's coming out to meet you, and when he sees you, he will be glad in his heart. You shall speak to him and put the words in his mouth, and I will be with your mouth and with his mouth, and will teach you both what to do. He shall speak for you to the people, and he shall be your mouth, and you shall be as God to him." Whew. He's really testing God here. Sort of I don't really believe you, but maybe you could do something to prove it. Now, Jesus famously quotes Deuteronomy 6:16 and Matthew 4:7 when he replies to the devil in the wilderness, "Again, it is written, you shall not put the Lord your God to the test." So the question to ask here is, why is God allowing this testing from Gideon? So, again, it comes back to seeing the heart here. God sees Gideon's heart. And so he's allowing this rather than the stern rebuke that Moses gets. He's being patient with him, just as he's still patient with us. So Gideon goes to prepare a young goat and unleavened cakes to bring to him. And this is where God performs a miracle. And Gideon, likely for the first time, realizes exactly who he's speaking to. Judges 6:20 through 22. "And the angel of God said to him, 'Take the meat and the unleavened cakes and put them on this rock and pour the broth over them.' And he did so. Then the angel of the Lord reached out the tip of the staff that was in his hand and touched the meat and the unleavened cakes, and fire sprang up from the rock and consumed the meat and the unleavened cakes. And the angel of the Lord vanished from his sight. Then Gideon perceived that he was the angel of the Lord, and Gideon said, 'Alas, O Lord God, for now I have seen the angel of the Lord face to face.'" God immediately in this moment moves to activate Gideon's faith. he calls him to go pull down the altar of Baal and cut down the Asherah pole that Gideon's father has. He's to replace these with an altar to the Lord and make a sacrifice of a 7-year-old bull. Now, at this point, Gideon has seen a miracle. He knows who he was talking to. He knows it this time. You would think he's seen enough. He's going right now. I'm going to get there. I'm cutting that thing down. I'll chop it down with an axe, a sword, chew through it with my teeth like a beaver if I have to. This thing's coming down, right? The altar of Baal, which is likely a bunch of stones, no big deal. We'll just, lean into it, right? It's going down. But spoiler alert, he doesn't. See, he knows that if he does this in broad daylight and everyone sees him, they're likely going to beat him to within an inch of his life, or maybe even kill him. So instead, under the cover of darkness, he sneaks out, not by himself, but with 10 of his servants to go do it. Now, thankfully, this whole thing ends well, even though the men of the town discover, it was Gideon. See, they call for his death, but his father, Joash, all of a sudden seems to find his faith in God and points out to the townspeople that if Baal is God, then he can fight for himself. And this earns Gideon the nickname Jerubbaal, which means, let Baal contend. Now, let's note a few things in the aftermath of this moment for Gideon, though. He's now seen 4 signs from God. First, he sees the prophet that God sent to talk to the people, right? There's an angel that God sent to talk to him, and God burns up Gideon's offering of goats, cakes, and broth. And our recent one, the altar and the pole are torn down, and Joash finds his faith and defends Gideon's actions for God. Now, one would think, or I would at least think, that Gideon would finally have found some confidence and start to believe that God is for him, it's not a joke, this is real stuff. Ready to stop doubting himself and God's plan for him. Unfortunately, he's not done yet. At this point, all of Gideon's enemies, all these Midianites, Amalekites, and the people of the east, which the Bible doesn't really explain, but it sounds like there's a ton of them. They've all amassed together in the valley of Jezreel. And Gideon has also called on the Israelites, including the tribes of, and bear with me here, Abiezer, Manasseh, Asher, Zebulun, and Naphtali, and they all show up to meet him. Now, this would have been more than 32,000 people to fight. Gideon should have felt an amazing swell of confidence, seeing another of God's miracle that the people respond. The people that up till now have been worshiping Baal and Asherah, all of a sudden are kindled to show up in the moment and be a part of this great work. But, as the Bible said previously, Gideon thought of himself as being the least of the tribes and the least among his tribe. So he still has doubts. In Judges 6:36 through 40, we see then Gideon said to God, "If you will save Israel by my hand, as you have said," like, wait, what? Dude, seriously? But continue on, Gideon. "Behold, I am laying a fleece of wool on the threshing floor. If there is dew on the fleece alone, and it is dry on all the ground, then I shall know that you will save Israel by my hand, as you have said." And it was so. That should be good, right? No, it's not. When he rose early next morning and squeezed the fleece, he wrung enough dew from the fleece to fill a bowl with water. So not a little bit. This is not like Well, coincidentally, accidentally, this may have happened. Although, it's possible that Gideon saw it that way. So Gideon says to God, let not your anger burn against me. This sounds like all of a sudden, oh yeah, I kind of remember that burning bush thing, and when your anger burned against Moses, please don't let it burn against me. But please let me test just once more with the fleece. Just one more time. Let's just do it one more time. This time, please let it be dry on the fleece only, and on all the ground let there be dew. And God did so that night, and it was dry on the fleece only, and on all the ground there was dew. Gideon tests God 2 more times here, and God patiently responds. Now, these combined with the others certainly should be enough. Now, I know I've said this like 4 times now, okay? And it really should be, because in my mind, I'm feeling like these are some miracles, okay? How many miracles does one person need to see to have their confidence ignited? But it's not enough for Gideon. I know that the last time I saw food burned up was because it fell between the grates in my barbecue grill. It's no miracle. This is what happens when you're not careful when you're cooking for the family, okay? I don't know exactly what a fleece is, but I've never seen one dry or wet when the ground was the alternate, let alone any other clothing. So despite Gideon's testing of God, it's worth noting that he continues to follow God's plan, although it does seem a little bit reluctantly. We can be just like him in that sense, where our faith can waver from moment to moment. When times are good, praise Jesus. Having a rough week? Where is God? Doesn't he care about me? And it can be hard in the tough times to fully trust that God sees us and is with us. It can feel like he's so far away. Maybe something else is taking up all of his attention. Maybe I'm not worthy of his attention. Now, these thoughts can lead us to feel like I believe Gideon felt. Abandoned, not good enough, doubtful, unaware of his worth. It's a terrible headspace to be in. But we don't have to stay there. See, God alone defines our worth. This is really what Gideon needs to come back to. He needs to get to. He needs to understand that God's love for us is immeasurable. We can see this in 1 John 3:1. See what kind of love the Father has given to us, that we should be called children of God. And so we are. See, God gave us his most precious gift in Jesus. And it is the ultimate evidence of his patience, of his love, his mercy, and his grace. That we, through our acceptance of Jesus as Lord and Savior, receive the inheritance to be called children of God, his children. Now, throughout this story, God is developing Gideon's faith by allowing the testing, but also through his commands that Gideon do certain things like tearing down the altar of Baal, cutting down the Asherah pole, raising this army. And now, Gideon's faith journey is going to really accelerate. He has an army of 32,000 people. Or does he? See, we see God speak to Gideon in Judges 7, verse 2. And here, God is telling Gideon, there are too many, and we need to whittle down this number. And it's not just God making things up on a whim. See, he knows the hearts of the Israelites, right? We do too, because we've seen it time and again through Judges, right? He knows that if they are victorious here with 32,000, they may decide that this is something they did of their own power. They saved themselves. God has Gideon tell the people that anyone who is fearful or trembling can return home. That's probably not a big deal. I mean, they showed up, right? 32,000, maybe 500. No. 22,000 people leave. Gideon is left with 10,000 soldiers. Okay, all right. Sounds like a well-sized army for the task at hand. I mean, honestly, these are probably the hardcore fighters, right? They're not scared. And I don't know about you, but if I was Gideon, I'm probably thrilled at God's idea. Let's absolutely get rid of the weak and scared people. They're not fit to fight and could wind up being a liability. Now that we've got 10,000 strong fighters, people who aren't afraid, let's get going, okay? Except God's not done there. 10,000? No. And in Judges 7:4, and the Lord said to Gideon, the people are still too many. Take them down to the water, and I'll test them for you there. And any one of whom I say to you, this one shall go with you, shall go with you. And any one of whom I say to you, this one shall not go, shall not go. So Gideon brings them down to the water, and there God gives instructions about who stays and who goes. Everyone who brings their hands to their mouths and laps the water stays. Goodbye to the rest. Kind of makes some sense to me when I think about it, right? We've now weeded out even more people who may not be serious warriors, right? After all, if they're dropping their heads down, eyes down to the water to drink, how are they going to keep watch for themselves, let alone me? I don't want to be next to somebody who's like, I just took an arrow because this guy wasn't paying attention. So finally, we have the elite warriors left. These guys must be the Navy SEALs or the Army Rangers of the Israelites, right? The mighty 300. Kind of just like in that movie about the mythical Spartans' battle at Thermopylae. Just these huge rippling muscles, big beards, angry faces, right? These are the professionals you want when going into battle with a massive army of marauders that have terrorized your life for 7 years. Let's get them machine guns, hand grenades, and bazookas, and unleash their fury. Who's with me? So, as awesome as that sounds, God had other plans for these 300. So that night, Gideon's got his 300. And God tells Gideon to go down to the camp and take it. He's given it over to him. However, God also says, and this is where God sees Gideon's heart and how full of doubt it still is. In verse 10 and 11, he says, but if you're afraid to go down to the camp with Purah, your servant, and you shall hear what they say, and afterward your hands shall be strengthened to go down against the camp. See, Gideon still isn't there yet. He's so close. He's done what was asked of him after his initial attempts to avoid it with words about his inadequacies, as if God didn't know everything about him and what he's capable of. Instead of storming the camp that God has given to him, Gideon takes Purah, and they head down to the camp only to discover a man telling about a dream he had had. The dream was a sign for Gideon confirming what God had already told him. And when Gideon hears it, and Purah confirms, this is a dream about you, Gideon, he worships God. Finally, he believes. We can kind of be the same way. I heard a joke once. It is a joke, but I think it could also be a story, like a cautionary tale. So once there was a guy, he's stuck on his roof, and water is rising all around his house. And he prays to God, oh God, please come save me. Now, after a while, a couple in a raft, they come floating along, and they're like, hey man, we have space. Why don't you join us? The water's getting higher. And he's like, nope, it's all good. God is going to save me. Okay, man, Suit yourself. Off they go. A little while later, a boat comes through, and they're like, hey, you need a ride? You're running out of acreage up there. And he's like, no, I'm holding out for God to save me. Away they go. Hours later, the water has pushed him to the very peak. He's at the top of the roof. There's nowhere to go here. And a helicopter comes along, and they drop this guy a ladder, and they're like, climb up the helicopter, and let's get out of here. And he is literally like, nope, can't do it. God's going to save me. God's got this. So off they go. Now, a while later, the water comes over the peak of the roof, surprise, surprise, and the man drowns. I know, I said it was a joke. So far, it's not that funny, but bear with me. So he enters the kingdom of heaven, and he meets God, and he asks God, Lord, I prayed to you to save me, but you didn't. What gives? I don't understand it. And God replies, my child, I sent you a raft. I sent you a boat. I even sent you a helicopter. What more do you want from me? We can hear God's exasperation kind of in this moment, right? Look at all these things I did for you. How could you miss them? How easy it is in our doubts to ignore the things that God sets before us, to miss the calling or come up with the excuses as to why that raft's not for you, why that boat's not for you, why the helicopter isn't your get-out-of-jail-free card. But Gideon seems to finally get it. Hallelujah, amen. This has been a long ride. He goes back to his camp and he divides the 300 into 3 companies armed with trumpets and jars with torches inside. Said they were the Navy SEALs and Army Rangers of the Israelites. These are definitely not the kind of weaponry that I would have had in mind if I was attacking an army encampment of 120,000 people. Gideon gives them instructions to blow their trumpets on every side of the camp when he blows his. Now, following this, they would shout, for the Lord and for Gideon. For Gideon, who has finally found his confidence in God. And with these instructions, they assembled near the outskirts of the camp and put the plan into action. Immediately, confusion and disarray breaks out in the Midian camp as the Lord sets every man upon each other. Then they fled. I love this, right? Like, this is the epitome of, I have given the camp to you. You don't even have to do anything. You just need to show up and yell at them, and they'll start killing each other. Right? So far, so good. At this point, this is a great story about a guy who had doubts, but the Lord helped him overcome them and grow his faith. Now, we're not done yet. You see, Gideon's faith has grown so much that he's leading literally 300 men with no weapons in pursuit of what is still a very large army of about 15,000 people, so that he could kill the kings of the Midianites, Zebah and Zalmunna. And eventually, he runs them down and beheads them. Gruesome end, but it's what was supposed to happen here, right? Gideon's faith and trust in God had grown to where he was willing to initially take on an encampment of 120,000 soldiers with only 300. And let's not forget, a long time ago, I know it feels like just 5 minutes ago, God called Gideon a mighty man of valor. Efficient and able, boy, do we see that now. 300 versus 120,000, and then 300 versus 15,000. But before Gideon's story ends, we actually see the culmination of his faith journey here. And this is what happens in Judges 8:22 through 23. The men of Israel said to Gideon, rule over us, you and your son and your grandson also, for you have saved us from the hand of Midian." Now, I love Gideon's response here. This is the peak of his faith. Gideon said to them, "I will not rule over you, and my son will not rule over you. The Lord will rule over you." After this, Israel enjoys peace for 40 years under Gideon. Now, what's the point of this story? Why was it written down in so much detail? There's so many other stories of Judges that are just like blip, blip, blip. But this one, so much detail here. And it's a reminder to us to trust in the Lord, to have confidence. When he calls us to his purpose, we know that it will be successful to his glory. Now, we cannot put our label or definition of success here, so let's not let that trip us up. Okay, we all have an idea of what success would look like, but that's probably not necessarily God's idea. Maybe an event that you put a specific number on to define success is your idea of success. So I'm going to use tool time yesterday. Maybe in my heart, I was thinking, 50 kids, this is going to be awesome, right? However, God's idea of success could be as simple as a small heart-changing moment for one child that sees God's love for them through our actions. Now, this may seem small to us, but I think we can all agree that it's not. It's not small at all. And success here is defined as to the standards of our God. Success made perfect through us getting out of the way so he can work through us. Now, this doesn't mean that we're going to be without doubt and fear. I'm not saying that. Those emotions are human emotions. But we can't let ourselves stay there. See, our God is bigger than our doubts. He's bigger than our fears. He is the God of the impossible. Think about it. Whatever you think cannot be done, God can do it. As we come to our time of Easter, remember that God has a plan for all of us, for our good, to save us. And this plan was completed in Jesus' sacrifice on the cross. Our God is worthy of our faith and trust. Let's not diminish his powers with our doubts and fears. Instead, in our weakness, we need to lean into him even more. As we come to trust him fully, both in the good and the bad, the hills and the valleys, we will develop that deep confidence, that contentment that Paul speaks about in Philippians 4, verse 11, when he says he has learned in whatever situation he is in how to be content. Paul explains it succinctly in verse 13 when he says, "I can do all things through him who strengthens me." And this should be our goal, that in whatever situation life provides, we can have confidence in the one who gives us strength.